The audit began at 9:17 a.m. on a Thursday. By 9:43, someone's career had already ended. They just didn't know it yet. That's the thing about forensic accountants. They don't announce themselves. They don't make dramatic entrances. They just start reading. And reading is how empires fall. The alarm on my phone went off at 5:47 a.m., not 5:45, not 6, 5:47. The specific time calculated to give me exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes before the first scheduled interaction of the day, a conference call with Daniel Ward at 8 a.m. to finalize the audit engagement letter. 2 hours and 13 minutes was enough time to shower, dress, review overnight emails, consume 400 milligrams of caffeine, and perform the mental preparation necessary to operate as a principal shareholder, rather than someone who still thought of herself as recently fired. The distinction mattered. I'd spent the last 4 nights at the Peninsula, not because my Astoria apartment had ceased to exist. The lease was still in my name, the radiator still clanked, the rent was still technically due, even though $1,850 now registered as a rounding error rather than an existential threat. But because going back there would require acknowledging that the woman who'd lived there, who'd counted pennies and gotten declined for eggs, was the same woman who now owned 40% of a Fortune 500 company. The cognitive dissonance would be structural, damaging. Better to maintain separation until the new identity had fully calcified. The suite smelled the same as it had every morning for the past 4 days. Beeswax, orchids, the particular nothing scent of air that had been filtered and conditioned and stripped of anything that might suggest the outside world existed. The curtains were still drawn. I'd left them that way deliberately. Natural light was useful for setting circadian rhythms. Artificial light was better for maintaining focus. I walked to the bathroom in darkness, navigating by memory and the ambient glow from the city 42 floors below. The shower routine had become standardized. Water temperature, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Duration, 17 minutes. The hotel provided Bulgari amenities, shampoo, conditioner, body wash in heavy glass bottles that suggested luxury through weight rather than scent. I used them mechanically, hair, skin. The basic maintenance required to present as someone who had their life organized. When I emerged, the mirror had fogged completely. I wiped it clear and looked at the face looking back. Same face, same asymmetrical eyebrows, same scar on my left knee visible if I looked down. But something in the expression had changed over the past 4 days. Harder, more settled. The expression of someone who'd made calculations and committed to their conclusions. I dried off with towels that weighed more than my entire bathroom setup in Astoria. Got dressed in the armor that had become uniform, Armani suit, this one in charcoal gray rather than black, white silk blouse, the Louboutins that made the specific sound that announced arrival, the Cartier that told time in a way that suggested time was a resource I controlled rather than something that controlled me. By 6:23 a.m., I was dressed, composed, and sitting at the desk in the suite's living area with my laptop open and coffee. That room service had delivered at exactly 6:15 because I'd requested it at exactly 6:15. And the Peninsula was the kind of place where precision was assumed. The coffee was perfect. Temperature, strength, of espresso to steamed milk that produced a cappuccino rather than a latte. I drank it while reviewing the overnight accumulation of information that now flowed to me as a board member rather than as an assistant. Email from David Chen, timestamped 11:47 p.m. the previous night. Audit engagement letter drafted. Forwarding to you and Daniel for review before board circulation. Outside firm is Pemberton and Ross, top-tier forensic accounting, no prior relationship with Vance Global. Proposed timeline, 8 to 12 weeks for full hexagon review. Let me know if you have concerns. I open the attachment. Read the engagement letter with the same attention I used to read merger documents at 11:42 p.m. when I was still someone whose job security depended on catching other people's mistakes. The letter was exactly what it needed to be. Comprehensive scope. Unlimited access to financial records, communications, decision-making processes. Authority to interview anyone involved in the acquisition. No carve-outs, no limitations. The kind of engagement letter that made executives nervous because it assumed nothing was off-limits. I drafted a response. Reviewed. Approved. Proceed with board circulation, sent at 6:31 a.m., early enough to signal that I was operational before most people's alarms went off, late enough to avoid seeming desperate or sleepless. The next email was from Patricia. Your permanent office setup is complete. IT has provisioned full board-level access to all systems. Building security has updated your keycard to include after-hours access, executive parking, space P107, and private elevator authorization. Your nameplate has been installed. Let me know if you need anything else. I read it twice. Focused on the phrase, permanent office setup. Permanent, not temporary. Not provisional, not until further notice. The semantics mattered. Permanent meant the organization had accepted, at least procedurally, that I wasn't going anywhere. That the 40% position wasn't a brief disruption, but a structural reality that required accommodation. I spent the next 43 minutes reviewing board materials I now had access to, strategic planning documents, competitive analyses, internal financial projections that showed where Julian thought that the company was going and what he thought it would cost to get there. The projections were aggressive, revenue growth of 23% year over year, EBITDA margins expanding from 31% to 34%, acquisitions totaling $1.2 billion over the next 18 months, the kind of targets that looked impressive in presentations and required either exceptional execution or creative accounting to achieve. I made notes, not because I needed to remember, I would remember, but because the act of writing created structure, turned observations into data, data into leverage. At 7:41 a.m., I received a text from Daniel. Morning. Ready for our call in 19 minutes? I replied, yes. He responded immediately, good. One note before we talk. Thomas Wright wants to meet with you. Separately from Julian, says it's about board governance. But I suspect he wants to understand your long-term intentions. Interested? I stared at that message for 11 seconds. Thomas Wright, CFO, the person who controlled the financial apparatus of Vance Global and had signed off on every acquisition I was now questioning. The person who'd voted to approve my audit, not because he believed in accountability, but because voting against a 40% shareholder was politically untenable. Now he wanted to meet, separately, to discuss intentions, which meant he was performing calculus of his own, running scenarios, trying to determine whether I was a temporary disruption or a permanent threat, whether he needed to defend Julian or distance himself, whether his own position was secure or vulnerable. I typed, yes. Schedule it. This week? Tomorrow, before market open. I'll coordinate. The call at 8 a.m. was procedural. Daniel walked through the audit engagement letter paragraph by paragraph, highlighting the sections that gave Pemberton and Ross authority to examine communications, interview staff, and request documents without prior approval from management. Julian is going to resist the communication access, Daniel said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they knew would be received poorly. He'll argue executive privilege, attorney-client protection, strategic confidentiality. Does he have grounds? I asked. Weak ones. The bylaws give the board audit authority over any transaction above $50 million. Hexagon was $340 million. He can argue privilege on specific documents, but he can't block the entire scope. Pause. He'll try anyway. Let him try, I said. It creates a record. A record of what? Obstruction, resistance to oversight, the kind of behavior that makes institutional investors nervous. I could hear Daniel's smile through the phone. You're thinking several moves ahead. I'm thinking about incentives, I corrected. Julian's incentive is to protect his decision-making authority. The board's incentive is to protect the company's valuation. Those incentives are aligned until they're not. The audit is where we find out which board members prioritize which incentive. And your incentive? I looked out the window at Manhattan waking up. 42 floors below, people were walking to subway stations and coffee shops and jobs where they worried about performance reviews and rent and whether their boss liked them. I used to be one of them. Accountability, I said. I want every decision Julian made to be documented, reviewed, and explained. I want a record that says either he acted in the company's best interest or he didn't, and I want that record to be unimpeachable. That's not an incentive, Daniel said quietly. That's a strategy. The strategy serves the incentive. Which is? I didn't answer immediately. Let the silence do its work. control, I said finally. Not of Julian, of the narrative. The new keycard arrived at 8:47 a.m. via hotel courier. Not Patricia, not building security. A Peninsula employee in the burgundy uniform who knocked precisely 3 times, waited exactly 4 seconds, then knocked again when I didn't immediately answer because I was finishing an email to Thomas Wright's assistant confirming tomorrow's meeting. "Miss Chen," he said when I opened the door. "Delivery from Vance Global Building Management." He handed me a manila envelope. Thick. The kind with a string clasp. My name printed on the front in a label that suggested it had been processed through official channels rather than hand-delivered as a courtesy. I signed for it. Tipped him $20 because the Peninsula staff remembered who tipped well and who didn't, and being remembered favorably was worth $20. When he left, I opened the envelope. Inside, the new keycard. My name embossed in gold. Elena M. Chen. Below that, in smaller text, principal, not board member, not shareholder, principal. The term was specific, deliberate. In corporate hierarchy, principals were owners, people whose authority derived from ownership rather than employment. People who couldn't be fired because they owned the thing doing the firing. I held the card for a moment, felt the weight of it. Plastic embedded with an RFID chip that would unlock doors I'd walked past for 3 years without being able to open. Elevators I'd ridden without being able to access certain floors. Parking spaces I'd never been allowed to use. The card itself was infrastructure. A piece of technology that granted access based on permissions coded into a database somewhere. It had no inherent meaning beyond the permissions it unlocked, but permissions were power. I turned the card over. The back was blank except for a magnetic stripe and a small Vance Global logo. No instructions, no explanation. The assumption was that anyone receiving this card already knew what it was for. I put it in my wallet next to the black Blackwood credit card and the old Vance Global employee badge I'd kept because throwing it away felt premature. 3 cards, 3 identities. Employee, revoked, owner, established. Heir, still being calculated. At 9:15 a.m., I left the Peninsula and took the car Patricia had arranged. Same black Mercedes, same driver who knew without being told that I preferred silence to small talk, to Vance Global. The drive took 9 minutes. I spent them reviewing the organizational chart I'd pulled from the board materials, names, titles, reporting structures, the formal architecture of who reported to whom and who had authority over what. But organizational charts only showed formal power. Real power flowed through informal channels, through who had Julian's ear, who controlled budget approvals, who could delay or accelerate decisions through strategic use of process. I needed to map both structures, formal and informal, to understand not just who had authority, but who had influence. The car pulled up to Vance Global at 9:24 a.m. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and heard the Louboutins make contact. That distinctive click. The announcement of arrival. The lobby looked the same as it had every day for the past week. Same marble, same logo. Same Kelly at the reception desk who now nodded at me with professional courtesy rather than confusion because she'd been told, probably by someone in HR, probably in a memo marked confidential, that I was a principal and should be treated accordingly. I walked to the elevator bank, pressed the call button, the elevator arrived. I stepped inside, used the new key card to access the 42nd floor. The reader beeped once. Green light. Authorization confirmed. The elevator began its ascent, and I watched the numbers climb with the same attention I'd watched them climb 1,000 times before. But this time I wasn't going to my desk, wasn't going to sit outside Julian's office and perform the function of filter and membrane and useful furniture. This time I was going to my office. The doors opened on 42. I stepped out and walked down the hallway toward the corner office Patricia had secured. The office with 1,400 square feet and floor-to-ceiling windows and a shared wall with Julian's domain. The door had a nameplate now, brushed steel, professional. Elena M. Chen Principal. I used the key card. Heard the lock disengage with a soft click. Pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office looked different than it had 3 days ago when I'd first claimed it. Someone, probably facilities management, probably acting on Patricia's instructions, had made it functional. The desk now had a computer, dual monitors, a phone with more buttons than I'd ever had access to as an assistant. The credenza held supplies, Legal pads, pens, a stapler, the accumulated detritus of executive work. The conference table had 4 chairs arranged at precise intervals. It smelled like new carpet and furniture polish and the particular emptiness of a space that hadn't yet been occupied long enough to develop character. I set my briefcase on the desk, sat down in the chair, adjusted it to the same specifications I'd set 3 days ago. Height, lumbar support, armrest position, the ergonomics of ownership. Turned on the computer. Logged in with the credentials IT had provided. The Vance Global Network opened up. Same desktop wallpaper as every other executive. The New York skyline at dusk. All those buildings like teeth. But my access was different now. I could see folders I'd never been able to access as an assistant. Financial data, strategic plans, board minutes going back 7 years. I spent 23 minutes exploring the directory structure, understanding what information existed and where it was stored and who else had access to it. Then I picked up the phone and dialed extension 4107. The line rang twice before someone picked up. Legal operations. This is Amanda. Amanda Reyes, Associate General Counsel, reported to David Chen, responsible for contract management, compliance documentation, and the administrative machinery that kept legal functioning. I'd met her maybe 6 times when I was Julian's assistant, had coordinated with her on document preparation, had found her competent and efficient and entirely uninterested in small talk. Amanda, this is Elena Chen, I said. I need to schedule time to review the Hexagon Media acquisition documentation. All of it. Internal memos, outside counsel communications, due diligence reports, everything that's not protected by attorney-client privilege. There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough that I could hear her recalibrating. Miss Chen, she said. Her voice had changed, more careful. The tone you use when talking to someone whose authority you're not entirely sure about. I'll need to coordinate with David on access protocols for board-level requests. The audit engagement letter grants the auditors unlimited access, I said. I'm requesting the same access in my capacity as principal. Section 6.2 of the bylaws. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll need to verify that with David. Of course, I said. I'll expect confirmation by end of day. I'll do my best. Amanda, I said quietly, this isn't a request that requires your best. This is a request that requires compliance with the corporate bylaws. I own 40% of this company. I have the right to review any document related to any transaction above $50 million. Hexagon was $340 million. Either I get access, or I escalate to the board and ask why legal operations is obstructing a principal's lawful request. Silence. Then, I'll have the documents ready for you by 3 p.m. today. Thank you, I said. I'll come to your office. I ended the call and set the phone back in its cradle. That was institutional friction. Amanda hadn't refused, hadn't argued, hadn't said no. She'd done what organizations always do when confronted with authority they don't want to acknowledge. She'd introduced process, verification, coordination, the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, let me check with my manager. It was resistance disguised as procedure, and I'd just shown her that procedure could be overridden by power. The phone on my desk rang 14 seconds later. I picked up. Elena Chen. Elena, it's David. David Chen, General Counsel. His voice had the particular tension of someone who'd just been told by a subordinate that a board member was making demands. Amanda said you're requesting the Hexagon files. That's correct. Can I ask why? The audit hasn't formally started yet. I'm preparing, I said. The auditors will ask questions. I'd like to be able to answer them, or at least understand what questions they should be asking. That's unusual. Principals generally don't involve themselves in the mechanics of audits. I'm not a general principal, I said. I'm a principal who was fired 3 days after preventing a catastrophic error in the same transaction I'm now auditing. I have context the auditors won't have. I intend to use it. I could hear David thinking, calculating, trying to determine whether this was a battle worth fighting. Okay, he said finally. I'll authorize the access. But Elena, if you find something, I need you to tell me before you tell the auditors. Legal needs to assess privilege and materiality. I'll tell you what I'm legally required to tell you, I said, which is anything that represents immediate risk to the company. Everything else goes in the audit record. That's not how this usually works. David, I said, letting a small edge into my voice. Nothing about this situation is usual. I'm not your adversary, but I'm not your client either. I'm a principal exercising oversight authority. If that makes you uncomfortable, I suggest you document your concerns in writing and send them to the board. Another pause. The files will be ready at 3 p.m., he said. He hung up. I set the phone down and looked out the window at Manhattan, performing its Tuesday morning choreography. All those people in all those buildings, unaware that 42 floors above 6th Avenue, someone was testing the limits of newly acquired power. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Audit kickoff meeting scheduled. Thursday, 9 a.m., Conference Room A. Pemberton and Ross will present scope and timeline. Full board attendance expected. Julian has requested the meeting be classified as executive session. I read it twice, focused on the last sentence. Executive session meant the meeting would be confidential. No minutes, no recording, no formal record of what was discussed, which meant Julian wanted to negotiate, to argue, to push back against the scope without creating documentation that could be used against him later. I typed back, executive session requires unanimous board consent. I don't consent. Meeting will be recorded per standard board protocols. Patricia's response came 30 seconds later. Noted. I'll inform Julian. I put the phone down and returned to the documents Amanda had provided at exactly 3 p.m. 247 files, emails, memos, financial models, due diligence reports from outside consultants. I'd been reading for 3 hours and had made it through maybe 30% of the material. What I'd found so far was exactly what I'd expected. Compressed timelines, aggressive assumptions, and a pattern of decision-making that prioritized speed over thoroughness. But I hadn't found the smoking gun yet. The single document that would prove Julian had acted recklessly or fraudulently or in his own interest rather than the company's. Maybe it didn't exist. Maybe the audit would find that Julian had simply been aggressive within the bounds of reasonable business judgment. Or maybe I was looking in the wrong place. I closed the file I'd been reading and opened a new search window, typed in a single name, Gregory Vance. Hit enter. The search returned 43 results. I opened the first one. An email from Julian to Thomas Wright, dated 6 months before the Hexagon acquisition. Subject line, Dad's approach to transformational deals. I started reading, and somewhere in my chest, something cold and calculating began to understand that the story I'd been telling myself about Julian, about competence and arrogance and the casual cruelty of men who fire people for being right, was missing a critical piece. Julian wasn't just protecting his authority, he was protecting his father's legacy. And that made everything more complicated. The email from David Chen arrived at 4:17 p.m., precisely 90 minutes after I'd requested full access to the Hexagon acquisition communications. Subject line, document access, additional protocol required. I opened it. Elena, further to our conversation this afternoon, I've consulted with outside counsel regarding the scope of principal access to acquisition-related communications. While we acknowledge your rights under Section 6.2, there are additional considerations we need to address before providing unrestricted access. 1. Attorney-client privilege. Approximately 40% of the Hexagon file contains communications with Cromwell and Associates and other outside counsel. These documents are protected and require privilege review before disclosure. 2. Strategic confidentiality. Several documents contain forward-looking strategy that could be competitively sensitive if disclosed. We need to establish appropriate confidentiality protocols. 3. Third-party consents. Some materials include information provided by Hexagon Media under NDA. We're confirming whether principal access triggers consent requirements. I've asked Amanda to prepare a privilege log. This will take 3 to 5 business days. Once complete, we can schedule a review session where you can examine non-privileged materials under appropriate safeguards. I appreciate your patience as we work through these issues properly. David, I read it 3 times. Every sentence was technically correct. Attorney-client privilege was real. Strategic confidentiality mattered. NDAs had teeth. But every sentence was also delay. 3 to 5 business days meant next week at the earliest. A privilege log meant someone in legal would spend days categorizing documents as privileged or not, with the default being privileged when in doubt. A review session under appropriate safeguards meant I wouldn't get copies. I'd have to read everything in a conference room while someone from legal watched to make sure I didn't photograph anything. This was how institutions resisted power without saying no. They said yes, but first. And first expanded to fill whatever time they needed to regroup, strategize, and build defenses. I looked at the timestamp again, 4:17 p.m. Late enough that if I responded now, David could claim he'd already left for the day. Early enough that he could claim he'd sent it with plenty of time for me to reply. The timing was deliberate. Everything in institutional resistance was deliberate. I opened a reply. David, I understand the considerations you've outlined. However, I note that the audit engagement letter gives Pemberton and Ross immediate access to all materials, including privileged communications, under appropriate confidentiality protocols. I'm requesting the same access framework. I will sign whatever NDAs are required. I will review materials on site under legal supervision, but I will not wait 3 to 5 days for a privilege log that the auditors won't need to wait for. Please have the documents available for my review tomorrow at 9 a.m. I'll plan to spend the full day in legal's conference room. Elena, I hit send at 4:23 p.m. 6 minutes later, my phone rang. David's extension. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. Elena Chen. Elena, it's David. I just saw your email. His voice had shifted. Less formal, more urgent. The tone of someone who'd been expecting negotiation and had instead received an ultimatum. I appreciate your position, but I don't think you understand the complexity of what you're asking. The privilege review isn't just administrative, it's substantive legal analysis. We can't rush it without risking waiver of protection. The auditors won't be doing privilege review, I said. They'll be given access under a common interest agreement that preserves privilege while allowing examination. I'm asking for the same framework. That's different. The auditors are acting on behalf of the board as a whole. You're acting as an individual principal. I'm acting as a 40% shareholder exercising oversight authority, I corrected. The distinction you're drawing doesn't exist in the bylaws. Either principals have access or they don't. If you're saying they don't, I need that position in writing so I can take it to the board. Silence on the other end, not long, maybe 5 seconds, but long enough that I could hear him calculating. I'll see what I can do, he said finally, but I can't promise everything will be ready by 9 a.m. Then have whatever is ready, I said. I'll start with that. Elena, he paused, can I ask what you're looking for? If you tell me what concerns you have, maybe I can help focus the review. This was the real question underneath all the procedure. David wanted to know what I knew, what I suspected, what evidence I was hunting for. If I told him, he'd know which documents to protect more carefully, which communications to flag as privileged, which materials to claim were covered by NDA. If I didn't tell him, he'd have to guess. And guessing was less efficient than knowing. I'm looking for the complete record, I said. I'm looking for how decisions were made, who made them, and what information they had when they made them. I'm looking for the same thing the auditors will look for. That's very broad. The audit scope is very broad, I said. I'm aligning my review with it. Another pause. I'll have documents ready for you tomorrow morning, David said. 9 a.m., conference room C in legal. Thank you, I said. I hung up and looked at the time. 4:31 p.m. 90 seconds of conversation to extract a concession that David had been prepared to delay for a week. But it wasn't really a concession. It was triage. He'd give me something tomorrow. Probably the least sensitive materials, the documents that had already been scrubbed and sanitized and stripped of anything genuinely interesting. He'd position it as cooperation while buying time to protect everything that mattered. Institutional resistance wasn't about winning, it was about slowing the opposition down until they got tired or distracted or ran out of resources. The question was whether I would get tired first. I pulled up my calendar. Tomorrow was already full. 7 a.m. meeting with Thomas Wright, 9 a.m. document review in legal. The audit kickoff had been moved to Thursday, which meant I had less than 48 hours to understand the hexagon file before Pemberton and Ross started asking questions I needed to be able to answer. I sent a text to Patricia. Need to cancel all Thursday meetings after the audit kickoff. Block the full day. Her response came immediately. Done. Anything else? Me. Background on Pemberton and Ross, who's leading the engagement, what their reputation is, whether they've worked with Vance Global before. I'll have a brief ready by tonight. I put the phone down and returned to the documents Amanda had provided, 247 files. I'd made it through maybe 35%. I had 16 hours before my meeting with Thomas Wright. I kept reading. The meeting with Thomas Wright was scheduled for 7 a.m. at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Vance Global. Not in the building, not in his office, not anywhere that corporate security cameras or badge readers or calendar systems would create a record of the conversation. The location had been his choice. Patricia had forwarded his assistant's email. Mr. Wright suggests Birch Coffee on 27th. Informal setting. Off the record. Off the record meant he wanted deniability. Meant whatever he was going to say, he didn't want it attributed to him later. Which meant it was either very useful or very dangerous. I arrived at 5:53 a.m. Early, but not so early it looked like I was eager. The coffee shop was the kind of place that catered to the pre-work crowd. Professionals who needed caffeine before their actual workday started. Small tables, exposed brick, the smell of espresso and ambition. Thomas was already there, seated at a corner table with a Wall Street Journal folded beside him and a black coffee that looked like it had been sitting for a while. He was wearing a suit, but no tie. The uniform of someone who was technically off-duty, but still needed to look professional. He stood when he saw me, held out his hand. "Elena, thank you for making time." "Of course," I said. We shook. His grip was firm but not aggressive. The handshake of someone who'd spent 40 years in finance and knew that every gesture communicated something. We sat. I ordered a cappuccino from the server who appeared within 15 seconds. This was the kind of place where service was efficient because tips were generous. Thomas waited until the server left before speaking. "I wanted to talk to you before the audit formally begins," he said. "Away from the office, away from the dynamics." "I appreciate that," I said. He picked up his coffee, didn't drink it, just held it. The gesture of someone who needed something to do with his hands. "I've been CFO of Vance Global for 16 years, he said. "I was CFO under Gregory. I've been CFO under Julian. I've signed off on probably 200 acquisitions in that time. Some worked, some didn't. That's the nature of growth strategy." I waited, didn't respond. Let him fill the silence. "The Hexagon acquisition was aggressive," he continued. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We paid a premium. We compressed the timeline. We took risks." He paused. "But we took those risks with good information and sound judgment. The decimal point error you found, that was a genuine mistake. It happens. You caught it. We're grateful." "Julian didn't seem grateful," I said quietly. Thomas's expression didn't change. Julian is protective of the company his father built. Sometimes that protectiveness manifests as defensiveness, but his instincts are generally sound. "Generally," I repeated. "Elena, I'm going to be direct with you. The audit you've called for is going to be disruptive. It's going to consume resources. It's going to create uncertainty. And it's going to surface things that might look questionable out of context, but made perfect sense at the time." "If they made sense, the audit will confirm that," I said. "Audits don't confirm sense," Thomas said. "Audits find deviations. They find processes that weren't followed perfectly. They find emails where someone said something intemperate. They find documentation gaps. And then they write reports that make those gaps look like evidence of wrongdoing, even when they're just evidence of people working fast under pressure." I took a sip of my cappuccino. It was perfect. The right temperature, the right ratio, the kind of coffee that cost $6 and was worth it. "Are you asking me to cancel the audit?" I asked. "I'm asking you to consider what you're trying to accomplish," Thomas said. "If you want accountability, I can give you that without an audit. I can walk you through every decision. I can show you the analysis. I can explain the trade-offs. But if you want to embarrass Julian or force him out, take control of the company, an audit won't do that. It'll just create a mess." "I don't want to embarrass anyone," I said. "I want to understand how decisions are made. I want to know if the processes we have in place are sufficient. I want to know if there are structural issues that need to be corrected." That's a very diplomatic answer. It's an honest answer. Thomas set down his coffee, leaned back, studied me with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation with missing variables. "You're very composed for someone who was fired 8 days ago," he said. "I've had time to process," I said. "Have you?" He tilted his head slightly. "Stealth, because from where I'm sitting, you discovered you own 40% of a Fortune 500 company, walked into a board meeting, forced through an audit, and set up an office on the executive floor, all within a week. That's not processing. That's executing a plan." I met his gaze. Didn't blink. Didn't look away. "I'm a principal," I said. "I'm exercising the rights that come with that position. If that looks like a plan, it's because I'm organized, Russ, not because I'm pursuing a vendetta. And if the audit finds nothing, then we'll all have confidence in Julian's decision-making. And if it finds something," I didn't answer immediately, let the question sit between us, "then we'll address it," I said finally, the way any responsible board would. Thomas picked up his Wall Street journal, unfolded it, refolded it, the gesture of someone buying time to think. "I'm going to give you some advice," he said, "not as CFO, as someone who's been in corporate finance longer than you've been alive." I waited. "Power in organizations doesn't flow from ownership," he said. "It flows from relationships. Julian has relationships. He has loyalty. People in this company have worked for him for years. They've been promoted by him, been rewarded by him. They trust him. You have 40%, but he has the organization." "Organizations change," I said. "Slowly," Thomas said. "And not because someone new shows up with a better claim to authority. They change because the new person builds relationships, earns trust, demonstrates that they're not a threat to the people who actually do the work." "Are you saying I'm a threat?" "I'm saying you're unknown," Thomas said. "And unknown is always threatening." My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. David Chen's office called. "Documents are ready for your 9 a.m. review. Conference room C." I glanced at it, put the phone away. "I need to go," I said. "I have a full day." Thomas nodded, stood when I stood, extended his hand again. "Elena," he said, as we shook, "I hope you find what you're looking for." "So do I said. I left Birch Coffee at 7:41 a.m. and walked the 3 blocks to Vance Global alone. Conference room C in legal was smaller than I'd expected, not the large boardroom-style space where depositions happened and outside counsel presented. This was an interior room. No windows, no natural light, just a long table, 8 chairs, and walls lined with filing cabinets that probably hadn't been opened in years because everything was digital now. It smelled like old paper, and the particular staleness of air that had been recirculated too many times. Amanda Rice was waiting when I arrived at 9:03 a.m. She stood when I entered, professional courtesy, the kind you show to principals even when you'd prefer not to. "Miss Chen," she said, "I have the first batch of documents ready for your review." She gestured to a stack of folders on the table, physical folders, paper. "These are the non-privileged materials from the preliminary due diligence phase, approximately 400 pages. I looked at the stack. It was substantial, but not comprehensive. The hexagon file had been thousands of pages. This was a fraction. "Where's the rest?" I asked. "Still under privilege review," Amanda said. "David asked me to prioritize the materials most relevant to the acquisition timeline." Translation: they'd given me the sanitized version, the documents that had already been reviewed and approved, and stripped of anything genuinely useful. "I'll need access to the privileged materials under a confidentiality agreement," I said. "David is working on that framework," Amanda said. "He'll have something ready by end of week." End of week. Another delay, another procedural barrier. I pulled out a chair, sat down, opened the first folder. "I'll be here most of the day," I said. "If you need to bring additional materials as they're cleared, I'm available." Amanda hesitated, just for a moment, the pause of someone calculating whether to say something or stay silent. "I'll check in at lunch," she said finally. She left, closed the door behind her. I started reading. The documents were exactly what I'd expected: clean, organized, unrevealing, preliminary financial analyses that showed Hexagon was a good acquisition target, market research that showed the media sector was growing, competitive intelligence that showed Vance Global could leverage synergies, nothing about the compressed timeline, nothing about the premium pricing, nothing about the decision-making process that had led Julian to pay $340 million for something valued at $280 million. I was 90 minutes in when there was a soft knock on the door. I looked up. "Come in." The door opened. A young woman stepped inside. Mid-20s, Southeast Asian, maybe Vietnamese, wearing a professional dress that was nice but not expensive. The uniform of junior staff who wanted to be taken seriously but couldn't afford the armor yet. "Miss Chen," she said, "I'm Lisa Nguyen. I'm an analyst in corporate development. I worked on the Hexagon financial model." I set down the document I'd been reading. "Lisa, what can I do for you?" She closed the door, didn't sit, stood near the table with the posture of someone who wasn't sure if they were allowed to be there. "Amanda said you were reviewing the Hexagon file," she said. I thought you might have questions about the model." I studied her, tried to understand what this was. An offer of help? A test sent by David to see what I was looking for? Something else? "I might," I said carefully. "What's your role in corporate development?" "I build the financial projections for acquisition targets," she said. "Revenue forecasts, cost synergies, IRR calculations. I model what we think the returns will be if we acquire a company." "And you built the model for Hexagon?" "I built the first version," she said. "In February, 6 months before we closed the deal." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Sit." She sat, folded her hands on the table. The gesture of someone who'd practiced looking composed. "What did your first version show?" I asked. Lisa glanced at the closed door, then back to me. "It showed a fair value of $280 million, she said quietly. "Based on revenue multiples and comparable transactions, I recommended we offer no more than $300 million to maintain acceptable returns." "We paid $340 million, I said. "I know." "What changed between your recommendation and the final price?" Lisa was quiet for a moment. Her hands tightened slightly on the table. "Mr. Vance changed the assumptions," she said. "He asked me to rerun the model with more aggressive synergy targets, higher revenue growth, faster cost reductions. When I did that, the model supported $340 million. "Did you think the new assumptions were realistic?" Another glance at the door. "I thought they were possible," she said. "If everything went perfectly, if we executed flawlessly, if the market conditions stayed favorable." "But not probable," I said. "Not probable," she confirmed. I leaned back in my chair. "Process this." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Lisa met my eyes. Hers were dark, calm, calculating. "That because you're going to find out anyway," she said. "The auditors will pull my models. They'll see both versions. They'll ask me why the assumptions changed. I'd rather you hear it from me first." "You're protecting yourself," I said. "I'm establishing a record," she corrected. I did the analysis I was asked to do. I flagged the risks. If the assumptions were aggressive, that was a strategic decision above my level. This was the first fracture. Not loyalty to me, not opposition to Julian, just a junior analyst calculating that when the audit started asking questions, she wanted to be on record as having raised concerns. She was choosing documentation over allegiance. "Do you have copies of both models?" I asked. "They're in the shared drive," Lisa said. "Financial planning folder, Hexagon subfolder. The files are dated." "Are they in the materials Amanda gave me?" "No," Lisa said. "Those are summary documents. The detailed models are in a different category. David would have to authorize access." "I see," I said. Lisa stood. "I should get back. But if you have questions about the model, about the assumptions, I'm happy to walk you through it." "I'll let you know," I said. She nodded, started toward the door, paused with her hand on the handle. "Miss Chen," she said. "The assumptions weren't the only thing that changed." I waited. "The timeline changed too," she said. "We were supposed to have 90 days for due diligence. Mr. Vance compressed it 37. He said we couldn't risk losing the deal to a competitor." "Was there a competitor?" "Not that I saw," Lisa said quietly. She opened the door and left. I sat alone in conference room C, surrounded by 400 pages of sanitized documents, and thought about what I'd just learned. Julian hadn't just paid too much. He'd paid too much in a hurry based on assumptions he'd changed to justify the price he wanted to pay. That wasn't aggressive deal-making. That was something else. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with an email from David Chen. Subject line, "Audit kickoff, rescheduled." I opened it with the certainty of someone who already knew what it was going to say. Elena, I've been informed by Pemberton and Ross that they need additional time to complete their preliminary review before the formal kickoff meeting. The audit launch has been rescheduled from Thursday to the following Monday. This will give them time to complete conflicts review, finalize engagement protocols, review initial documentation. I know this is frustrating, but it's standard practice for engagements of this scope. The delay will ultimately result in a more efficient audit process. New kickoff meeting, Monday 9 a.m., conference room A. David, I read it twice. The delay was strategic. Not Pemberton and Ross's idea. They'd already confirmed they were ready to start. This was David buying time, or Julian buying time through David. 5 more days before the auditors started asking questions. 5 more days to prepare defenses, align stories, clean up documentation. I pulled up my calendar, looked at the next 5 days, looked at what I had scheduled, what I could move, what I could accelerate. Then I opened a new email to Patricia. Patricia, I need a meeting with the Pemberton and Ross engagement partner. Tomorrow, if possible. Just me, not the full board. I want to understand their methodology before the kickoff. Also, I need everything in the corporate development shared drive related to Hexagon. Financial models, scenario analyses, sensitivity tests. If David asks why, tell him I'm preparing for the audit and need to understand the analytical foundation. And one more thing, I need background on Lisa Nguyen, analyst in corporate development, how long she's been there, who she reports to, performance reviews if accessible. Elena, I sent it at 2:53 p.m. Patricia's response came at 2:55 p.m. On it, I closed my laptop and looked around conference room C. 400 pages of documents that told me nothing useful. So a junior analyst who'd just given me the first real lead I'd had, and a 5-day delay that someone thought would protect them. They were wrong. Delays didn't protect people from audits. They just gave investigators more time to dig. And I was very good at digging. I gathered the folders Amanda had provided, stacked them neatly, left them on the table for her to refile, walked out of legal and back to my office where the Gregory Vance files were still waiting on my computer. I had 5 days before the audit started. 5 days to understand not just what Julian had done, but why. 5 days to map the relationship between a dead father and a living son and a company built on money that had been stolen 30 years ago. I sat down at my desk, opened the files, started reading. The preliminary audit data arrived at 11:23 a.m. on Friday in the form of a password-protected PDF attached to an email from Pemberton and Ross. Not from the engagement partner, not from anyone senior. From a staff auditor named Michael Cho, whose email signature indicated he was a senior associate with 3 years of experience and a certification I didn't recognize. The email was brief. Ms. Chen, per your request for early visibility into our preliminary findings, please find attached our initial data summary for the Hexagon Media acquisition timeline analysis. This represents approximately 15% of our full scope review. Please note, this is preliminary work product and should not be distributed or cited without firm approval. We will provide comprehensive findings at the formal presentation. Password, HX2E24 Prelim. Michael Cho, CPA, Senior Associate, Pemberton and Ross LLP. I read the email twice before opening the attachment. Focused on 2 phrases, 15% of our full scope and should not be distributed. 15% meant this was either the easiest data to analyze or the least sensitive. Either way, it wasn't the complete picture. And should not be distributed meant they were establishing legal cover. This document couldn't be used against them if it turned out to be incomplete or incorrect. I entered the password. The PDF opened. 47 pages, tables, charts, timeline visualizations. The aesthetic of forensic accounting. No color, no decoration, just data arranged to reveal patterns. I started reading. The first section was titled Transaction Timeline Analysis, Key Milestones. A table showed the major events in the Hexagon acquisition. Initial contact, February 14th. First meeting, February 28th. Letter of intent, March 15th. Due diligence period, March 16th. April 22nd, 37 days. Final agreement, April 23rd. SEC filing, April 26th. Close, May 3rd. Standard deal progression. Nothing remarkable except the compressed timeline, which I already knew about. The second section was titled Comparative Timeline Analysis. This was more interesting. Pemberton and Ross had pulled data on 15 comparable acquisitions Vance Global had completed in the previous 5 years. They'd calculated the average due diligence period, 87 days, median, 92 days, hexagon, 37 days, 43% of the average, 40% of the median. The statistical outlier was visualized in a chart that made it impossible to miss. 14 acquisitions clustered in the 80 to 100 day range, and one hexagon sitting alone at 37 days like a data point that didn't belong. But this was information I already had. Lisa had told me the timeline was compressed. The board materials had documented it. This wasn't revelation, it was confirmation. Section 3, Financial Model Version Analysis. Here, Pemberton and Ross had done something more sophisticated. They'd pulled every version of the hexagon financial model from the shared drive, tracked changes, documented when assumptions were modified, created a genealogy of the deal's financial justification. The table showed 6 versions of the model. Version 1.0, February 28th, Lisa's original, fair value 289. Version 1.1, March 8th, minor updates, fair value 285 manual. Version 2.0, March 15th, assumption changes, fair value $320. Version 2.1, March 18th, further adjustments, fair value $335. Version 3.0, March 22nd, final assumptions, fair value $341. Version 3.1, April 15th, post-LOI refinements, fair value $340. The evolution was clear. Over 3 weeks, the model had been adjusted upward by $60 million, 21% higher than the original analysis. But what caught my attention was what wasn't in the data. Pemberton and Ross had documented that the assumptions changed. They'd shown the financial impact. But they hadn't documented who requested the changes, hadn't identified who made them, hadn't pulled the email trail that would show the decision-making process, which meant either A, they hadn't gotten access to those communications yet, or B, they'd gotten access and those communications were being categorized as privileged. Either way, the most important information was missing. Section 4, Approval Chain Documentation. This section was shorter, 2 pages, a table showing who had signed off on each stage of the acquisition. Financial Model Approval, Thomas Wright. Legal Review, David Chen, General Counsel. Board Authorization, full board vote, 7-0, 1 abstention. Final Execution, Julian Vance, CEO. Standard Corporate Governance, every signature in place, every approval documented, everything proper and procedural and completely uninformative about actual decision-making. Section 5 was titled Outstanding Data Requests. This was the most useful section because it told me what Pemberton and Ross hadn't received yet. Email communications between CEO and CFO read hexagon pricing, requested 10-1, pending legal review. Board meeting minutes, executive session discussions, requested 10-1, pending privilege determination. External advisor communications, requested 10-2, pending third-party consent. CEO calendar entries for hexagon-related meetings, requested 10-3, pending privacy review. Every item marked pending, every request blocked by procedure. I closed the PDF and sat back in my chair. 15% of the full scope. Enough to confirm what I already suspected, but not enough to prove anything. Enough to show that questions existed, but not enough to answer them. I pulled up my email and started typing. Michael, thank you for the preliminary data summary. A few questions. 1. What is your estimated timeline for receiving the outstanding communications currently under legal review? 2. Have you encountered resistance to any of your data requests beyond standard privilege review? 3. Section 3 shows assumption changes in the financial model, but doesn't identify who requested those changes. Is that information accessible? Elena Chen, I sent it at 11:47 a.m. At 12:03 p.m. I received a response, not from Michael, from the engagement partner. Ms. Chen, this is Richard Pemberton. Michael forwarded me your questions. I appreciate your engagement with our preliminary work. To address your questions directly. 1. We typically receive privilege reviewed documents within 2 to 3 weeks of initial request. We're currently on schedule. 2. We have not encountered unusual resistance. Standard corporate legal review is proceeding normally. 3. The identification of who requested model changes will be included in our full report once we've completed our interview process. I should note that while we appreciate principal involvement, our engagement is with the board as a whole. Our methodology requires we maintain independence from individual stakeholders to ensure objectivity. We'll be happy to address detailed questions at the formal presentation on Monday. Best regards, Richard Pemberton, Managing Partner, Pemberton & Ross, LLP. I read it twice. The message was clear. Back off. You're a principal, not our client. We'll give you what we give the full board. Richard Pemberton was drawing boundaries, establishing that I couldn't use my 40% position to influence the audit process, which meant I couldn't rely on Pemberton & Ross to find what I needed them to find. They were conducting a proper audit, following standard methodology, respecting privilege and procedure. If I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. The change in the executive floor's behavior was subtle enough that it took me 2 days to recognize the pattern. It started with calendar entries. On Thursday, I'd sent meeting requests to 3 department heads: Jennifer Ramos, Investor Relations; Marcus Tang, Corporate Strategy; and Paul Henderson, Business Development. Standard introductory meetings, 30 minutes each. All 3 had accepted immediately. Jennifer for Monday at 2 p.m., Marcus for Tuesday at 10 a.m., Paul for Tuesday at 3 p.m. On Friday morning, I received 3 emails within 40 minutes of each other. Jennifer's assistant, Ms. Ramos, needs to reschedule Monday's meeting due to a conflict that just came up. Would next Thursday work? Marcus's sister Tang has been called into an urgent strategic planning session Tuesday morning. Could we push your meeting to next week? Mr. Henderson is traveling unexpectedly next week. His assistant will follow up when he returns to reschedule. 3 cancellations, 3 different excuses, all within the same 2-hour window. I walked down to the executive floor kitchen at 10:47 a.m. Not because I needed coffee. I'd already had my morning cappuccino. Because the kitchen was where informal information flowed. The kitchen was empty, except for one person, Sarah Kim, executive assistant to Margaret Seo, the head of corporate strategy. Sarah was mid-30s, competent, had been at Vance Global for 6 years. We'd overlapped when I was Julian's assistant. She looked up when I entered, smiled, the professional smile. "Elena," she said, "how are you settling in?" "Well," I said, "I moved to the espresso machine, started the ritual of making coffee I didn't need." "Busy week, I can imagine." Sarah was organizing something in the refrigerator, moving containers. "Big changes." "Some changes," I agreed. "How's Margaret?" "Busy, always busy." Sarah closed the refrigerator, turned to face me. "Actually, I meant to reach out. Margaret wanted me to let you know she's available if you want to schedule time to talk about strategy, corporate governance, whatever would be helpful as you're getting oriented." Margaret Seo, the only other woman on the board before I'd arrived, reaching out through her assistant rather than directly, offering help in language that was careful and non-committal. "That's generous," I said. "I'd appreciate that. Early next week?" "I'll check her calendar and send you some options," Sarah said. She left the kitchen. I stood there with my unnecessary espresso and thought about what had just happened. Margaret was performing outreach, but doing it through her assistant, creating distance, maintaining deniability. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. Another cancellation. The IT briefing I'd requested about system access protocols had been postponed pending review of security frameworks. Another delay. David Chen's office had sent a revised timeline for the privilege review, now estimated at 2 weeks instead of 1. Another deflection. Patricia had forwarded me a message from Julian's assistant saying he was unavailable for direct meetings until after the audit kickoff, but happy to address any concerns through board channels. The pattern was becoming visible. I wasn't being blocked, I was being contained. People weren't refusing to meet with me, they were rescheduling. Departments weren't denying my requests, they were adding review processes. Every interaction was being pushed into documented, official, attributable frameworks. Nothing casual, nothing off the record. They were treating me as a source of institutional risk. I returned to my office and spent the afternoon mapping the organization, not the formal org chart, I already had that, the informal network. Who talked to whom? Who had been promoted by Julian versus inherited from Gregory? I built a spreadsheet. Names, roles, years at company, career progression. Then I added a column, loyalty vector. For each person, I estimated whether their primary allegiance was to Julian, to the institution, or to their own career preservation. Julian's people, 60% of senior leadership, institution people, 25%, self-interested people, 15%. The question was, how many people needed to move from Category 1 to Category 3 before the organizational dynamics became unstable, and whether that instability would create access or create more resistance. I found it at 9:47 p.m. on Friday while reviewing the Gregory Vance files for the third time. I'd sorted the files differently this time, by document type instead of by date, legal memoranda in one folder, financial records in another, correspondence in a third, and in a fifth folder labeled simply corporate records, documents that Arthur had obtained through methods that weren't clear. Board minutes, internal memos, filing receipts. Most of it was unremarkable. Evidence that Arthur had been tracking Vance Global's operations, documentation of his 40% position being exercised through shell companies. But one document was different. A memo, single page, dated March 3rd, 1994. The date made me pause. 1994 was when Gregory had left Blackwood Chen Development, when he'd taken the money and incorporated Vance Global. The memo was from Gregory Vance to Arthur Blackwood. Subject line, final settlement, Blackwood Chen dissolution. I read it. Arthur, per our conversation, I'm confirming the terms we discussed for final settlement of all obligations related to Blackwood Chen Development Corporation. 1. I will resign as CFO effective March 15, 1994. 2. You will receive full ownership of remaining BC assets, estimated value $75,000. 3. I will retain rights to the Northern Boulevard property transaction. 4. All parties agree this constitutes full and final settlement of any claims. I appreciate your understanding during this difficult transition. I wish you well. Gregory, I read it 3 times. Then I opened the forensic accounting memo Morrison and Pierce had prepared for Arthur in 2012, the one that documented the theft. The one that showed Gregory had stolen $500,000 to start Vance Global. According to that memo, the Northern Boulevard property had been sold without proper authorization. $250,000 had been diverted. It was theft. But according to Gregory's 1994 memo, Arthur had agreed to let Gregory retain rights to that transaction, had accepted $75,000 in remaining assets as full and final settlement. I opened a new search window, searched the Gregory Vance files for any other references to Northern Boulevard or final settlement. Found 2 more documents, a letter from Arthur to Gregory dated March 1st, 1994. Handwritten, I don't agree with what you're doing, but I won't stop you. Take what you need, just make sure Margaret never knows. A corporate dissolution filing for Blackwood Chen Development Corporation, dated March 20th, 1994. Signed by both Arthur Blackwood and Margaret Chen. I sat back in my chair. The story I'd constructed based on the 2012 forensic memo was, Gregory stole money from Arthur's company, built Vance Global with stolen capital. Arthur discovered it years later. But these 1994 documents said something different. Arthur had known in 1994, had known immediately, had agreed to it, had let Gregory take the money, had accepted a settlement. The only person who wasn't supposed to know was Margaret, my mother, which meant the theft story was a construction, a narrative created later, in 2012, 18 years after the fact. I pulled up the timeline. 1994, Gregory leaves Blackwood Chen with Arthur's documented consent. Settlement signed. Company dissolved. 2008, Arthur invests in Vance Global, begins acquiring equity position. 2012, Arthur hires Morrison and Pierce to investigate and document the original 1994 transaction as theft. 2 versions of the same transaction, both documented, both notarized. The private version, negotiated settlement. The legal version, corporate theft. Both existed in Arthur's files. Both were equally official. Both contradicted each other. I closed the files and sat in the dark office. Arthur had created contradictory records, had preserved both versions, had left them both for me to find. But I couldn't determine why. The simplest explanation was that Arthur had been building leverage, creating multiple narratives that could be deployed depending on circumstances. But that assumed Arthur had anticipated needing leverage against Julian specifically, had anticipated me discovering the inheritance, had anticipated this exact situation, and I had no evidence for that level of foresight. I pulled up the dates again, looked at when Arthur had commissioned the 2012 investigation, June 2012. I searched Vance Global's corporate timeline, checked what had been happening in June 2012, found it. Julian had become CEO in May 2012, 1 month before Arthur had commissioned the forensic investigation, which meant the timing wasn't random. Arthur had waited until Julian took control, had commissioned the investigation immediately after the leadership transition. But I didn't know why. I searched the files for anything else from 2012, any explanation, any context, found nothing. Just the investigation, just the contradictory record. Just two versions of history sitting in the same archive with no explanation for why both existed. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness. I'd found leverage, information that could be used in multiple ways depending on what I needed. But I didn't understand the system that had created it. Didn't understand why Arthur had preserved both the settlement agreement and the theft narrative. Didn't understand why the timing had aligned with Julian's promotion. Didn't understand what Arthur had known in 2012 that had made him create a legal weapon 18 years after the original transaction. The leverage existed, the contradiction existed, the explanation didn't. I sat in my office at 6:17 a.m. on Saturday morning with both documents open on my laptop screen. Left side, Gregory's 1994 memo to Arthur, settlement agreement, mutual consent, clean dissolution. Right side, Morrison and Pierce's 2012 forensic report, unauthorized transactions, diverted funds, corporate theft, same events, same dollar amounts, same Northern Boulevard property, contradictory characterizations. I'd been staring at them for 43 minutes. Not reading. I'd already read both documents enough times to have them memorized, just looking, trying to understand the geometry of what Arthur had built. The simplest explanation was that Arthur had created insurance, had documented the 1994 settlement in real time, then commissioned a forensic investigation 18 years later that reframed the same transaction as theft. Two narratives, two legal positions, deployable depending on circumstances. But that explanation required Arthur to have anticipated needing leverage against Julian specifically, required foresight about events that hadn't happened yet in 2012, required Arthur to have known that Gregory would step down, that Julian would take over, that something would happen that would make the dual narrative useful. And I had no evidence for that level of planning. I pulled up the timeline again, focused on the dates. March 1994, Arthur's handwritten letter to Gregory. Take what you need, just make sure Margaret never knows. March 3rd, 1994, Gregory's memo confirming settlement terms. March 20th, 1994, Blackwood Chen Development dissolution filing, signed by both Arthur and Margaret. 18 years of silence. June 2012, Arthur commissions Morrison and Pierce to investigate the 1994 transaction. July 2012, Wall Street Journal reports Gregory stepping down as CEO due to health concerns. Julian takes over. The timing was precise. Arthur had commissioned the forensic investigation 1 month after Julian became CEO, which meant the investigation wasn't about Gregory, it was about Julian. Or it was about something Julian represented. Some change in the organization's structure or strategy or direction that had made Arthur decide he needed documented leverage. But I didn't know what that change had been. I opened a new search window, pulled up Vance Global's SEC filings from 2012. Started reading. Form 8K filed May 15, 2012. CEO transition. Gregory Vance stepping down. Julian Vance appointed. Form 10Q filed August 14, 2012. Second quarter results. Revenue up 18%. 2 acquisitions completed. Nothing unusual. Standard corporate filings. Normal growth trajectory. I kept reading, found something in the November 2012 10Q, buried in a footnote about related party transactions. In November 2012, the company entered into a consulting agreement with Blackwood Strategic Partners, LLC, for advisory services related to corporate development and strategic planning. Fees paid during Q4 2012, $347,000. Blackwood Strategic Partners, Arthur's entity. I searched the Gregory Vance files for any reference to Blackwood Strategic Partners or consulting agreements. Found a contract. Dated November 8, 2012. Between Vance Global and Blackwood Strategic Partners. Scope of work: strategic advisory services including but not limited to merger evaluation, corporate governance review, and competitive analysis. Term 3 years. Compensation $125,000 per quarter. Total value $1.5 million. I read it twice, then read the signature block. Signed for Vance Global by Julian Vance, CEO. Signed for Blackwood Strategic Partners by Arthur Blackwood. Arthur had commissioned the forensic investigation in June 2012, 1 month after Julian became CEO. Arthur had signed a consulting agreement with Vance Global in November 2012. 5 months after commissioning the investigation that reframed his 1994 settlement with Gregory as theft. And Julian had signed it. Had agreed to pay Arthur $1.5 million over 3 years for strategic advice, which meant Julian had known Arthur was a shareholder, had known Arthur had a relationship with the company, had known enough to engage him as a consultant. But the consulting agreement made no reference to Arthur's equity position, no reference to the 40%, no disclosure that Arthur was simultaneously an investor and an advisor. That should have been disclosed, should have been flagged as a conflict of interest, should have required board approval. I pulled up the board minutes from November 2012, found the entry. CEO reported engaging Blackwood Strategic Partners for advisory services. Board noted no objection. 8 words. No discussion of who Blackwood Strategic Partners was, no mention of Arthur's equity stake, no analysis of whether paying a major shareholder for consulting services created governance issues. Just, board noted no objection. I sat back and tried to understand what this meant. Arthur had created the theft narrative in June 2012, had positioned himself as someone with a potential legal claim against the company, had documented that Gregory had stolen money to start Vance Global. Then Arthur had signed a consulting agreement with that same company 5 months later, had accepted $1.5 million in fees, had formalized a relationship with Julian. The sequence didn't make sense unless the consulting agreement was something other than what it appeared to be. I opened my email and started typing. Patricia, I need all documentation related to Blackwood Strategic Partners' work for Vance Global between 2012-2015. Deliverables, reports, invoices, communications, everything. Also, I need the board minutes from every meeting between November 2012 and Arthur's incapacitation. Full minutes, including executive session discussions if accessible. Elena, I sent it at 6:54 a.m. Knew Patricia wouldn't see it until Monday. Knew it would take days to gather the materials. Knew I was initiating a process that would signal to legal and compliance that I was expanding my investigation beyond Hexagon. But I needed to understand what Arthur had been doing between 2012 and his decline. Needed to know what strategic advisory services had actually meant. Needed to know if the $1.5 million had been payment for consulting or payment for something else. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Ward. Early start. Are you at the office? I replied, yes, I'm 15 minutes away. Can I stop by? Something you should see before the audit kickoff Monday. I looked at the time, 6:57 a.m. on a Saturday. Daniel was awake, was coming to the office, had something that couldn't wait until Monday. I'll be here. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looked out at Manhattan waking up. The city at this hour was quieter, fewer cars, fewer people. The infrastructure of density without the density itself. Below, I could see early joggers, dog walkers, the maintenance workers who kept the city functional while everyone else slept. I'd been one of those maintenance workers once, not literally, but functionally. The person who arrived early and stayed late and kept the machinery running so that people like Julian could operate without friction. Now I was the friction. Daniel arrived at 7:13 a.m. carrying a leather portfolio and 2 coffees from the blue bottle downstairs. Thought you might need this, he said, handing me one. You're here early for a Saturday. So are you, I said. He smiled. Thin, professional, the smile of someone about to deliver information they wish they didn't have to deliver. May I? I gestured to the conference table. We sat. Daniel opened his portfolio and pulled out a single document, slid it across the table to me. This arrived at my office last night, he said, delivered by messenger, no return address, just this. I picked it up. It was a letter, single page. Typed on letterhead I didn't recognize, Morrison and Pierce LLP dissolved partnership. Dated October 15, 2024, 2 weeks ago. Addressed to interested parties re Blackwood Family Archive. I read it. To whom it may concern. Morrison and Pierce LLP was dissolved in 2019 following the retirement of founding partners. As part of our standard document retention protocols, we are required to notify relevant parties when privileged materials are scheduled for destruction. Our records indicate that in 2012, this firm prepared confidential forensic analysis for Arthur Blackwood regarding corporate transactions dated 1994. Per our retention policy, these materials are scheduled for destruction on November 1, 2024. If any party believes these materials should be preserved for legal or investigative purposes, please contact our document custodian within 15 days of this notice. Regards, Estate Administrator, Morrison and Pierce LLP. I read it twice, then looked at Daniel. When did you receive this? I asked. Yesterday, 6 p.m. Messenger delivered it to my home address, not my office. Your home address, I repeated. Yes. How would Morrison and Pierce have your home address? I don't know, Daniel said. I've never worked with them, never had any contact with that firm. I set the letter down. This is dated October 15th, 2 weeks ago. Yes, and it says the materials are scheduled for destruction on November 1st, which is Monday, Daniel said, the same day as your audit kickoff. I looked at the letter again, focused on the language. Interested parties RE Blackwood Family Archive, not Arthur Blackwood's estate, not Elena Chen, not Vance Global. Interested parties, which meant this letter wasn't specifically addressed to anyone. It was a blanket notification. The kind of thing law firms sent out when they were dissolving and needed to clear their document retention liability. Except it had been delivered to Daniel's home, personally, by messenger, which meant someone had wanted Daniel specifically to see it, had wanted him to know that the 2012 forensic analysis was about to be destroyed, had given him exactly 2 weeks' notice. What do you want to do? Daniel asked. I want to preserve those materials, I said, immediately. That will require a formal document preservation request, Daniel said, which means disclosing to Morrison and Pierce's custodian that you're conducting an investigation, which means potentially alerting whoever sent me this letter that you're aware of the materials. Whoever sent you this letter already knows I'm aware of the materials, I said. They delivered it to you because they knew you'd bring it to me. This is an invitation, not a warning. Daniel was quiet for a moment. An invitation to do what? To preserve evidence before it's destroyed, I said, or to try to preserve it and reveal what I know. You think this is a test? I think this is information being controlled, I said. Someone wants me to know the 2012 investigation exists, wants me to know it's about to be destroyed, wants to see if I'll move to preserve it. And if you do, then I've confirmed that I have access to Arthur's files, that I know about the 1994 settlement, that I'm investigating the origin of Vance Global's founding capital. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You're saying someone is creating a record of what you know. I'm saying someone is forcing me to create a record of what I know, I corrected. If I don't preserve the materials, they're destroyed and I lose access to the full forensic analysis. If I do preserve them, I have to file a formal request that documents exactly what I'm investigating and why. Damned either way. Not damned, I said. Documented. I pulled out my phone, opened my notes, started typing. Document preservation request. Morrison and Pierce materials. 2012 forensic analysis re Blackwood Vance transaction. All supporting documentation, all communications between M&P and Arthur Blackwood. All billing records. I looked up at Daniel. If I'm going to be documented, I might as well be comprehensive. You want me to file this? He asked. I want you to file it Monday morning, I said. Before the audit kickoff, before the materials are destroyed. On the record, this will signal to the board that you're investigating beyond Hexagon. The board already knows I'm investigating beyond Hexagon, I said. Thomas Wright knows, Margaret Seo knows, Julian knows. They're all waiting to see what I find. This just tells them I'm finding it. Daniel picked up the letter from Morrison and Pierce. Read it again. Who do you think sent this? Someone who had access to Morrison and Pierce's dissolution records, I said. Someone who knew the 2012 analysis existed, someone who knew I would care about preserving it. That's a very small group of people. Yes, I said. Daniel stood, gathered the letter, put it back in his portfolio. I'll have the preservation request filed first thing Monday morning. Anything else? Yes, I said. I need you to pull every consulting agreement Vance Global has entered into in the past 15 years. I want to know who else has been paid for strategic advisory services. I want to know if there's a pattern. You think Arthur wasn't the only consultant? I think Arthur's agreement was unusually structured, I said. No competitive bid, no detailed scope, no deliverables specified, just $125,000 per quarter for 3 years. That's either very trusting or very deliberate. I'll pull the contracts, Daniel said. But Elena, if you're right, if someone is controlling information and creating records of your investigation, you need to consider who benefits from that. I have considered it, I said. And I don't know yet, I said. Which is why I'm going to keep creating records until the pattern becomes clear. At 9:47 a.m. on Monday, I received an email from David Chen. Subject line, document preservation request response required. I opened it. Elena, I've received Daniel Ward's document preservation request regarding the Morrison and Pierce materials. I need to discuss the scope and implications of this request before we proceed. Specifically, 1. The request covers materials that predate your role as principal and may include privileged attorney work product. 2. Preserving these materials may trigger disclosure obligations to the board regarding the nature of your investigation. 3. The timing immediately before the audit kickoff creates potential complications regarding the scope of the Pemberton Ross engagement. I'd like to schedule a call today to discuss. Are you available at 2 p.m.? David, I read it twice. Then checked the time, 9:49 a.m. The audit kickoff was at 9 a.m. I'd deliberately missed it. Had sent my regrets to Patricia at 8:47 a.m., citing a scheduling conflict. Had let the board meet with Pemberton and Ross without me. Had created absence instead of presence, because I needed to know what the auditors would say when I wasn't in the room. Needed to know how Julian would position the investigation. Needed to know which board members would ask questions and which would stay silent. Patricia had promised to send me a summary, but the summary would be sanitized. Diplomatic, the official version. What I needed was the unofficial version. The body language, the silences, the things that didn't make it into minutes. I typed a response to David. David, I'm available at 2 p.m., but I want to clarify something before our call. The document preservation request is not optional. The materials are scheduled for destruction today. Either we preserve them or they're gone. The complications you've identified are real, but they're secondary to the preservation timeline. I'm happy to discuss scope and disclosure, but the preservation order needs to be filed today regardless of those discussions. Elena, I sent it at 9:52 a.m. At 9:54 a.m., David replied, understood. I'll file the preservation order within the hour. We'll discuss implications on the call. I closed my email and pulled up the calendar entry Patricia had sent me for the audit kickoff. Attendees, full board, Pemberton and Ross engagement team, David Chen, Thomas Wright, agenda, engagement scope overview, preliminary findings summary, timeline and deliverables, Q&A, expected duration 90 minutes. It was now 9:56 a.m., which meant that they were 26 minutes into the presentation, probably finishing the scope overview, probably about to start discussing preliminary findings. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. Elena, I know you're taking notes in the meeting, I said, but I need you to do something else. I need you to track who asks questions, who objects, who stays silent. I need to know the dynamics. That's not typically part of board minutes, Patricia said. Her voice was quiet, professional, the voice of someone who was in a room with other people and couldn't speak freely. I know, I said, but I need it anyway, informal notes, just for me. Can you do that? A pause. Then yes. Thank you, I said. I ended the call and turned back to my computer. Opened the spreadsheet I'd built on Friday, the org chart with loyalty vectors, the map of who reported to whom and who had worked together and who had been promoted by Julian versus inherited from Gregory. Added a new column, information access. For each person, I estimated what they knew, what they had access to. what they could see versus what they were being shown. Then I added another column, document trail. For each person, I noted what records existed of their decisions, what emails they'd sent, what approvals they'd signed, what meetings they'd attended. Because if someone was controlling information, if someone was creating records and destroying records and sending anonymous letters to Daniel's home address, then they had to have access to both the information systems and the document retention systems, which was a very specific skill set, a very specific position. Not legal. David didn't have access to Morrison & Pierce's dissolution records. Not IT. They could see systems but not legal retention schedules. Not compliance. They tracked policies but didn't control outside counsel. Someone who bridged all three functions. Someone who had visibility into legal strategy and document management and information systems. I pulled up the Vance Global org chart, looked for positions that reported to multiple departments, positions that sat at intersections. Found one, Chief Administrative Officer, reported to CEO. Oversight of legal operations, compliance, IT infrastructure, document management. Current CAO, Rebecca Portman. Tenure, 14 years. Hired by Gregory Vance, 2010. Promoted to CAO by Julian Vance, 2013. I opened a new search window, pulled up Rebecca Portman's background, her LinkedIn, her professional history. Education, NYU Law, 2002. Previous employer before Vance Global Morrison & Pierce LLP, 2002 to 2010. Title, Senior Associate, Corporate Governance Practice. I stared at that line for a long time. Rebecca Portman had worked at Morrison & Pierce for 8 years. Had been there when Arthur commissioned the 2012 forensic investigation. Had left Morrison & Pierce and joined Vance Global in 2010, 2 years before the investigation. And now, Morrison & Pierce was sending document destruction notices to Daniel's home address. And Rebecca Portman was the Chief Administrative Officer responsible for document management at Vance Global. I pulled up Rebecca's contact information, extension 4200, office on the 41st floor. Picked up my phone, put it down. If I called Rebecca directly, I would be signaling that I knew she was connected to Morrison & Pierce, would be revealing that I'd made the connection, would be creating a record of my awareness. But if I didn't call her, I would have no way to verify whether she was the source of the anonymous letter. No way to understand whether she was helping me or testing me. I opened my email instead. Started typing. Rebecca, I'm conducting a review of Vance Global's document retention policies as part of my oversight responsibilities. I'd like to schedule time to discuss. 1. Current retention schedules for legal materials. 2. Procedures for handling dissolution notices from outside counsel. 3. Protocols for preserving materials subject to investigation. Are you available this week? Elena, I read it 3 times. The language was neutral, professional, the kind of request a principal could reasonably make. But the timing, immediately after Daniel filed the Morrison & Pierce preservation order, would signal that I understood the connection. I sent it at 10:17 a.m. At 10:19 a.m., Rebecca replied, Elena, I'm available Thursday at 3 p.m. I'll have our retention policies prepared for your review. Rebecca. 2 sentences, no questions, no pushback, just availability and preparation, which meant either A, Rebecca had expected my inquiry, or B, Rebecca had been instructed to cooperate with principal requests, the Bagan. Either way, the response time, 2 minutes, suggested the message had been anticipated. I closed my email and pulled up the Morrison & Pierce letter again. Read the signature block. Estate Administrator Morrison & Pierce LLP, dissolved, no name, no contact information, just a title and a dissolved entity. I opened a new browser window, searched for Morrison & Pierce LLP Dissolution New York, found a legal notice published in the New York Law Journal, dated March 2019. Morrison & Pierce LLP, a professional corporation organized under New York law, hereby gives notice of its dissolution, effective March 31, 2019. All client files and work product have been transferred to successor firms or returned to clients. Document retention inquiries should be directed to Portman & Associates, document custodian. Portman & Associates. I searched for that name, found a small document management firm, specializing in legal retention. Principal Rebecca Portman, the same Rebecca Portman who was Chief Administrative Officer at Vance Global who had worked at Morrison & Pierce from 2002 to 2010, who had been promoted to CAO in 2013, 1 year after Arthur commissioned the forensic investigation, who now ran the document custodian service responsible for Morrison & Pierce's dissolution records, who had sent Daniel the letter about materials scheduled for destruction, who had just responded to my inquiry within 2 minutes. I sat in my office and tried to understand what I was looking at. Rebecca Portman had access to everything: the Vance Global systems, the Morrison & Pierce archives, the document retention schedules, the legal communications. She'd been hired by Gregory in 2010, promoted by Julian in 2013, had stayed in place for 14 years while the company grew and the board changed and the power structure shifted. And now she was the person who controlled what got preserved and what got destroyed. I pulled up my phone, typed a message to Daniel, who appointed Rebecca Portman as document custodian for Morrison & Pierce's dissolution. His response came 4 minutes later. Checking. Why? Because she works for Vance Global, has since 2010, currently CAO. That's a significant conflict of interest. I'll find out who approved the appointment. I put the phone down and looked out the window at Manhattan. Somewhere in this system, in the overlapping networks of legal retention and corporate governance and document management, someone had built a structure that allowed information to be controlled across institutional boundaries. Someone who could preserve materials at one firm and destroy them at another. Someone who could send letters to Daniel's home and file preservation orders at Vance Global. Someone who had been in position since 2010, before Arthur's investigation, before Julian became CEO, before any of this had started. Someone who had been there when Gregory was still running the company. And I didn't know if that person was helping me or managing me. My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. Audit kickoff finished. Board asked about your absence. Julian said you were attending to principal responsibilities. Thomas asked if those responsibilities related to the audit scope. Julian said he didn't know. Margaret asked if the board should be concerned. Julian said no. Meeting adjourned at 10:30 a.m. Pemberton and Ross will present findings in 3 weeks. I read it twice. 3 weeks until the audit results. 3 weeks until Pemberton and Ross delivered whatever they'd found in the hexagon files. 3 weeks while I tried to understand who had built this system and why. I opened my laptop, pulled up the Gregory Vance files one more time, searched for any reference to Rebecca Portman, found nothing. Searched for Chief Administrative Officer or CAO. Found one document. A board resolution dated January 2013, approving the creation of the CAO position and the appointment of Rebecca Portman. Moved by Thomas Wright, seconded by Julian Vance, approved unanimous. I read the resolution. It was brief, standard language about creating operational efficiency and centralizing administrative functions. But there was a note at the bottom, handwritten, in a script I didn't recognize. Per GV directive, maintain continuity, GV. Gregory Vance. The resolution had been approved in January 2013. Gregory had stepped down in May 2012, had granted Julian power of attorney in November 2012. But in January 2013, 2 months after granting Julian control, Gregory had given a directive about Rebecca Portman's appointment, had specified that her role was to maintain continuity. I stared at those 2 words. Maintain continuity, not improve efficiency, not streamline operations, maintain continuity, which implied Rebecca's function wasn't operational, it was structural. She was there to make sure something stayed consistent across the leadership transition, across Gregory's decline, across Julian's assumption of control. But I didn't know what that something was, and I didn't know if Rebecca was maintaining it for Gregory's benefit or for someone else's.